The city was alive with the hum of activity as my car glided smoothly through the bustling streets. The familiar skyline loomed ahead, a testament to the years of relentless work that had brought me here. As I leaned back into the plush leather of my seat, the air conditioner's cool breeze contrasted sharply with the stifling summer heat outside. It was the kind of day that made me reflect, made me think about the strange and winding road that had led to this moment. From the outside, my life probably looked perfect. Leonard Matthews, self-made millionaire, real estate mogul, a man who had clawed his way up from nothing to sit at the top. My name was on the lips of every ambitious young entrepreneur in the city, the kind of name that invoked both admiration and envy. But what they didn't see was the journey that had shaped me, the dirt under my nails that I could never quite wash away, no matter how many designer suits I wore. My mind wandered back to the factory, that grimy place where it all began. I could still smell the metallic tang of oil and sweat that had permeated the air, still feel the rough texture of the mop handle that I had gripped tightly as I scrubbed the floors. The echo of the machines, the clanking of tools, and the muted conversations of workers trying to keep their heads down. It was all still so vivid, despite the years that had passed. I wasn't supposed to be anything more than a cleaner. That was what everyone said, and for a long time, I believed it. I remember the pitying looks, the sneers, the way people would talk about their dreams while looking at me as if I had none of my own. But they were wrong. I had dreams, big ones. Dreams that I had scribbled down in an old battered notebook during my breaks, when no one was watching. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small frayed piece of paper, the last remnant of that notebook. It was a list of goals, written in the shaky hand of a younger, more naive Leonard. Some of the items were crossed off, small victories like save enough for a driver's license and buy a suit for interviews. Others were bigger, more ambitious, like own a business and become someone they can't ignore. Those were the dreams that had driven me, that had kept me going through the darkest of times. And dark times there had been plenty. The kind that made you question everything, made you want to throw in the towel and accept that maybe you were destined for nothing more than what you had. My girlfriend back then, Rachel, was my anchor, or at least I thought she was. She had been with me through the hardest parts, or so I believed. But when I made the decision to quit my job at the factory and start over, she didn't see the leap of faith. All she saw was a fool throwing away the only security he had. "Leonard, you're dreaming if you think you can do this," she had said, her voice laced with both frustration and fear. I could still see the way she had looked at me that night, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're going to lose everything, and I can't watch you do that to us." Us. That was the word that stuck in my mind as she packed her things and walked out of our tiny apartment, leaving me standing there with nothing but my dreams and a rapidly fading sense of hope. There was no us anymore. It was just me and the cold, hard world that didn't give a damn whether I made it or not. But something inside me snapped that night. I wasn't going to be the man people pitied, the one who was always on the verge of something, but never quite got there. No, I was going to make it, and I was going to do it in a way that no one could ignore. So I worked, harder than I ever had before. I took on every job I could find, cleaning, driving, odd jobs that paid next to nothing, but kept me moving forward. I networked with anyone who would listen, learned from every mistake, and gradually I started to see the pieces fall into place. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, failures that hit like gut punches, but I refused to stay down. And then came the break I needed, a chance encounter with a real estate developer who saw something in me, a drive, a hunger that he said reminded him of his younger self. He offered me a position as a driver, but more than that, he offered me mentorship. For the first time, I had someone who believed in my potential, who pushed me to think bigger, to act bolder. I learned everything I could about the real estate business, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. I watched as deals were made, properties were developed, and fortunes were built. And then when the time was right, I took the leap myself. I sold everything I had, my small apartment, my car, everything, and poured it into my first property. It was a gamble, a high-stakes risk that could have ended in disaster. But it didn't. The property sold, and I made enough to reinvest. From there, it was a matter of building on that momentum, growing, expanding, until I had a portfolio that could rival the biggest names in the city. But even now, with all the success I've achieved, I can't forget where I came from. That's why I keep this tattered piece of paper with me, a reminder of the dreams that started it all. And it's why, as my car pulls up to the grand opening of my latest agency, I feel a mix of pride and unease. I've made it, yes, but the journey isn't over. There's always more to achieve, more to prove, to myself, if no one else. I step out of the car, adjusting my suit and looking around at the gathered crowd. They're here to celebrate my success, to congratulate me on another milestone. But as I walk toward the entrance, something tells me that today will be about more than just the accolades. There's a strange feeling in the air, a sense that something unexpected is about to happen. And as much as I pride myself on being prepared for anything, I know that life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. The crowd outside my newest real estate agency buzzed with anticipation. The grand opening was supposed to be a celebration, a testament to my journey from nothing to everything. Balloons in the company colors framed the entrance, their bright hues standing out against the sleek, modern facade of the building. A line of journalists stood ready, cameras flashing, microphones at the ready to capture the moment when I would cut the ribbon and officially open the doors. This was supposed to be a day of triumph, of basking in the glow of success that had been so hard-earned. But as I stepped out of the car and into the sun's blinding glare, something shifted. There was a feeling in the air, something electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. I could feel it prickling at the back of my neck, an inexplicable sense that today wasn't going to go as planned. I adjusted my sunglasses, scanning the crowd, trying to pinpoint what was setting off my instincts. As I moved toward the entrance, I could hear the usual greetings. "Mr. Matthews, over here." "Leonard, can we get a statement?" But my focus was elsewhere. Then I saw her. At first glance, she was just another face in the crowd, one among many. But as I got closer, something about her pulled at a memory I hadn't revisited in years. She was an elderly woman, her frame small and hunched, wrapped in a threadbare coat that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was a tangle of gray, her skin weathered and lined with age. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. Those eyes filled with a quiet desperation, searching for someone. She stepped forward, and the crowd seemed to part around her, as if she were a ghost, barely noticeable to anyone else. Her hand trembled as she reached out toward me, palm upturned, her voice barely a whisper over the noise of the event. "Please, sir, just a little something for bread." Her words hit me harder than they should have. I had seen beggars before. New York was full of them. But this was different. There was something in her tone, a pleading that went beyond hunger, beyond the immediate need for sustenance. It was as if she was asking for more than just food, as if she was asking for hope. I hesitated, my usual defenses crumbling as I looked into her eyes. Something about her was familiar, a nagging sense that I should know this woman, but I couldn't quite place it. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. But it wasn't until I glanced down at her hands that it all came crashing back. Her hands were gnarled with age, but on her ears, nearly hidden by the wild mess of her hair, were the earrings. Tiny, delicate things, once beautiful, but now tarnished and worn. I knew those earrings. I had seen them before, in another life, in another world entirely. "Mrs. Thompson." I felt the ground shift beneath me as recognition struck. The memories came flooding back. Cold nights spent shivering on park benches, my mother's tear-streaked face, and the warmth of a stranger's kindness. Mrs. Thompson had taken us in when we had nowhere else to go, offering food and shelter when the world had turned its back on us. She had been the light in the darkest time of my life. And now here she was, reduced to begging on the streets, her once sharp features dulled by years of hardship. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could barely breathe as I looked at her. This woman who had saved me and my mother from despair. Mrs. Thompson. The words slipped out before I could stop them, a mix of disbelief and guilt. How had it come to this? How had I let this happen, not even knowing the fate of the woman who had given us so much? Her eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly masked it with a tired smile. "Do I know you, son?" she asked, her voice trembling, as if she were afraid of the answer. I nodded, my throat tight. "It's Leonard. Leonard Matthews. You helped us once. My mother and me." Recognition flickered in her eyes, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The noise of the crowd faded, the flashing cameras and eager journalists becoming nothing more than background noise. It was just the two of us, standing there, a bridge between past and present. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she covered her mouth with a shaking hand. "Leonard, my boy. I never thought." Before she could finish, a sudden commotion broke out behind us. The journalists had noticed our interaction, and within seconds, they were upon us, shouting questions, pushing microphones toward us, eager to capture the moment. I could see the confusion and fear in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as the crowd pressed in, overwhelming her. "Mr. Matthews, who is this woman? Is she a relative? Why is she here? Can we get a statement?" The questions came fast and furious, a barrage of noise that only seemed to heighten Mrs. Thompson's anxiety. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, and I knew I had to get her out of there. "Please, step back," I shouted, raising my hands to ward off the press. "Give us some space." The security team quickly moved in, creating a barrier between us and the frenzied journalists. I took Mrs. Thompson by the arm, gently guiding her away from the crowd, toward the entrance of the building. She moved with surprising lightness, her steps quick and uncertain, as if she might bolt at any moment. Once we were inside, the noise of the crowd muffled by the thick glass doors, I led her to a quiet corner of the lobby. The agency staff glanced curiously at us, but said nothing, sensing that this was not the time for questions. "Mrs. Thompson," I said softly, "what happened? How did you end up like this?" She sighed heavily, the weight of years of hardship evident in that one exhalation. "It's a long story, Leonard, one that I'm not sure you want to hear." "I want to hear everything," I insisted, my voice firm. "Please tell me. I owe you that much." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine, as if weighing whether she could trust me with her burdens. Finally, she nodded and began to speak. Her story was a litany of misfortunes, each more heart-wrenching than the last. After my mother and I had moved on, Mrs. Thompson's life had taken a downward spiral. Her husband had passed away, leaving her to care for their granddaughter, Emily, alone. Then came the tragedy. Emily's life was forever altered by the violent actions of a local police officer. The system that should have protected them instead turned a blind eye, and they were left to fend for themselves. As she spoke, I felt a burning anger rise within me. Anger at the injustice, at the cruelty of a world that had allowed this to happen. But more than that, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Guilt that I had moved on, built a life of comfort and success, while Mrs. Thompson had been left behind to suffer. By the time she finished, there were tears in both our eyes. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Mrs. Thompson, I promise you, I'm going to make this right. Whatever it takes, I'm going to help you and Emily." She looked at me with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone was finally offering her a lifeline. "You don't have to do that, Leonard. You've already done so much." I shook my head. "It's the least I can do. You saved my life once, and now it's my turn to help you." As the words left my mouth, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. This wasn't just about repaying a debt. It was about righting a wrong, about standing up for the people who had been forgotten and discarded by a system that didn't care. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to rest until Mrs. Thompson and Emily had the justice and peace they deserved. As I walked her out of the building, away from the prying eyes of the press, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was the start of something much bigger. Something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself and about the world I had built around me. But whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The office I led Mrs. Thompson into was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle clink of glassware on the desk, and the muted lighting created a calm, almost surreal atmosphere. I pulled out a chair for her, watching as she eased into it, her movements slow and deliberate. It was clear that life had worn her down, but there was still a resilience in her that couldn't be broken. I settled into the chair opposite her, leaning forward slightly, trying to bridge the gap between our two very different worlds. "Mrs. Thompson," I began, my voice low and gentle, "please, tell me everything. I need to understand what happened." She looked at me, her tired eyes filled with a sadness that seemed too heavy for one person to carry. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, that the burden of her story was too much to share. But then she sighed, a deep, weary sound, and began to speak. "It all started not long after you and your mother moved on," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, John, God rest his soul, he passed away suddenly. A heart attack, they said. One moment he was there, laughing with our granddaughter Emily, and the next, he was gone." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she wrung them together. The loss of her husband had clearly left a deep scar, but it was evident that this was just the beginning of her troubles. "After John died, it was just me and Emily. She was everything to me, Leonard. A bright, beautiful girl, full of dreams. She wanted to be a teacher, you know. She loved children, loved the idea of helping them learn and grow. But life had other plans." Her voice cracked on that last sentence, and she looked away, trying to collect herself. I waited, not wanting to rush her, but the tension in the room was palpable. I could feel the weight of what was coming next, and it made my heart race with anticipation and dread. "It was a warm September evening," she continued, her voice now tinged with bitterness. "Emily had left work early to come home and celebrate my birthday. We were going to have a little party, just the two of us. But she never made it." Mrs. Thompson's hands clutched at the fabric of her coat, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "She was followed, Leonard, followed by a man who should have protected her, a local police officer named Alex. He'd been harassing her for weeks, making unwanted advances, but she never told me how bad it was. She didn't want to worry me, she said." My blood ran cold at the mention of the officer's name. The idea that someone who wore a badge, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, had been the source of her torment was sickening. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my emotions in check as she continued. "That night, Alex was drunk. He followed her into the building, ignored her protests, and forced himself on her. Right there, in the stairwell of our apartment building. She fought, Leonard, she fought with everything she had, but he was stronger. He hurt her in ways I can't even begin to describe." Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, and she wiped them away with a trembling hand. When she finally broke free, she tried to run, but she stumbled. She fell down the stairs. The impact damaged her spine, crippled her. She was found hours later by a neighbor, lying there, unable to move, her body broken, her spirit shattered. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. The horror of what she was describing felt almost too much to bear, and I could barely contain my anger. How could something like this happen? How could someone like Alex be allowed to walk free after committing such an atrocity? "I rushed to the hospital as soon as I heard," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But the damage was done. The doctor said she would never walk again without surgery. They operated, but they botched it, made things worse instead of better. Emily was left bedridden, in constant pain, with no hope of recovery." I sat back in my chair, trying to process the enormity of it all. The woman who had saved me from the streets was now telling me the story of her own devastation, and I felt a deep, gnawing guilt that I had been oblivious to her suffering for so long. "But that's not even the worst of it," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice now laced with a quiet fury. "We tried to seek justice, to hold Alex accountable for what he did. But the system, it's rigged, Leonard. Rigged to protect people like him. He denied everything, claimed that Emily had come onto him, that she'd fallen by accident. And his connections, his friends in the force. They made sure the case never saw the light of day. I could see the anguish in her eyes as she relived the nightmare, the helplessness of being trapped in a system designed to keep people like her down. We couldn't afford a good lawyer, couldn't fight the way we needed to. And the hospital, they refused to admit they'd made a mistake. Said the surgery was a success, despite all evidence to the contrary. They wouldn't even do a follow-up operation without payment, money we didn't have. Her words hung in the air, a bitter testament to the cruelty of the world. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, my anger boiling over into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was an injustice, one that I couldn't ignore. I had to sell everything, Leonard, she whispered, her voice broken. Our apartment, our possessions, all of it, just to keep her alive. We moved to a rundown cottage outside the city, far from anyone who might care. But it wasn't enough. Emily's condition worsened, and I couldn't stand to see her suffer. I started begging, hoping to scrape together enough to buy her medicine, to ease her pain, even if just a little. Mrs. Thompson looked up at me, her eyes pleading. I don't know what to do anymore. I tried everything, but it feels like the world has forgotten us, like we're just disposable. My heart ached for her, for Emily, for the countless others like them who had been crushed by a system that promised justice, but delivered only despair. I knew then that I couldn't walk away from this. I couldn't just hand her some money and move on with my life. Mrs. Thompson, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me, you're not disposable. Emily is not disposable. And I'm going to make sure that both of you get the help you deserve. I'm not just going to sit by and let this happen. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. But Leonard, you have your own life, your own responsibilities. You don't have to. I do, I interrupted, the words coming out more forcefully than I intended. You saved me once. You saved my mother and me when we had nothing. Now it's my turn to help you. I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm going to find Emily the best medical care available. We'll get her the surgery she needs, and we'll make sure it's done right this time. And as for Alex, he's not going to get away with this. I don't care how many connections he has. He's going to face justice, one way or another. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude, of hope. Thank you, Leonard. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, I said, shaking my head. This isn't about repayment. It's about doing what's right. As I stood up, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. This was bigger than business, bigger than money. This was about justice, about using the power and influence I had accumulated to right a terrible wrong. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. The fight for justice is never easy, especially when the system is stacked against you. But I also knew that I couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. As I walked Mrs. Thompson out of the office and arranged for a car to take her home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. One where the stakes were higher, where the challenges were greater, but where the rewards, both for me and for those I sought to help, would be worth every ounce of effort. And as I watched the car drive away, taking Mrs. Thompson back to her world of hardship, the drive home was a blur. My mind raced, plotting out the steps I would need to take, the people I would need to call. This wasn't just about helping Mrs. Thompson and Emily. This was about making sure that the system that had failed them was held accountable. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Powerful people protected their own, and Alex, the corrupt police officer, was no exception. But I was no longer the scared, desperate boy Mrs. Thompson had once sheltered. I had resources, connections, and a burning resolve that nothing could extinguish. The first call I made was to Thomas, a lawyer I had met years ago during a particularly nasty business dispute. He was the kind of attorney who thrived on impossible cases. The more high-profile and controversial, the better. As the phone rang, I stared out the window at the darkening sky, my reflection a grim silhouette against the city lights. Leonard, to what do I owe the pleasure? Thomas's voice was smooth, almost too casual, but I knew he was already intrigued. I need your help, Thomas, I said, cutting to the chase. And this isn't just any case. It's personal. There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Go on. I told him everything about Mrs. Thompson, Emily, the assault, the botched surgery, and the systemic corruption that had allowed Alex to walk free. As I spoke, I could feel my anger bubbling to the surface, each word a reminder of the injustice that had been done. Jesus, Leonard, Thomas muttered when I finished. This is intense. You realize what you're asking, right? Going after a police officer, especially one with connections, is going to be a hell of a fight. We're talking about taking on the department, the city, maybe even the state. I know, I replied, my voice steely. And I don't care. This needs to be done, Thomas. They've suffered enough, and it's time someone made things right. He sighed, but I could hear the resolve in his voice. All right, I'm in, but we need to be smart about this. First, we'll dig into Alex's past, find out who his connections are, what skeletons he's got hidden. Then we'll build our case, and when the time is right, we'll hit them hard. But Leonard, you have to be prepared for this to get ugly. I'm prepared, I said without hesitation. Just do whatever it takes. After I hung up with Thomas, I made another call, this time to Dr. Patel, one of the best neurosurgeons in the country. We had crossed paths years ago when I was developing a luxury medical center. He owed me a favor, and I intended to collect. Dr. Patel, I began as soon as he answered. I have a situation that requires your expertise. I explained Emily's condition, the failed surgery, and how she had been left to suffer without hope of recovery. Dr. Patel listened carefully, his voice growing more concerned with each detail. This is tragic, Leonard, he said finally. But I need to see her medical records before I can commit to anything. If what you're saying is true, she'll need immediate intervention, and it won't be easy. I'll have the records sent over within the hour, I assured him. And Dr. Patel, money is no object. Whatever it takes, we'll make sure she gets the best care possible. I'll do everything I can, he promised, and I knew he meant it. Patel was a man of integrity, one who had never shied away from a challenge, especially when it meant saving a life. By the time I reached my penthouse, the sky had turned a deep indigo, the city's lights twinkling like stars against the night. But there was no comfort in the luxury around me tonight. My mind was too restless, my soul too burdened by the weight of the promises I had made. I poured myself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as I stared out at the city below. This was my empire, built from nothing, piece by piece. But what good was power if I didn't use it to fight for those who had none? Mrs. Thompson's story had ignited something in me, something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond business, beyond wealth. As I took a sip, I thought back to the boy I had been, standing in the rain outside that factory, dreaming of a life beyond the grime and poverty. Back then, justice had seemed like a distant, abstract concept, something for others, not for people like me. But now, with the means and influence I had acquired, I realized that justice wasn't just an ideal. It was a responsibility, one I could no longer ignore. The next morning, I was up before dawn, my mind already racing with plans. Thomas had texted me late into the night, promising updates on Alex's connections by the end of the week. Dr. Patel was reviewing Emily's records, and I had already instructed my assistant to clear my schedule for the day. There was work to be done, and I intended to see it through personally. I drove to the cottage where Mrs. Thompson and Emily lived, a modest, dilapidated place on the outskirts of the city. As I approached, I could see the wear and tear on the structure, the peeling paint, the cracked windows, the sagging roof. It was a far cry from the comfortable life Mrs. Thompson had once known, and it filled me with a renewed sense of urgency. Mrs. Thompson opened the door, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. But when she saw me, a flicker of hope crossed her features. Leonard, she greeted me softly, stepping aside to let me in. I wasn't expecting you so soon. I had to come, I replied, stepping into the small, dimly lit living room. I made some calls last night, and we're going to get things moving quickly. Her eyes filled with gratitude, but there was still a hesitation in her voice. Leonard, you've already done so much. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Mrs. Thompson, I said firmly, taking her hand. You and Emily deserve better than this. and I'm going to make sure you get it." She led me down a narrow hallway to Emily's room. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a small space dominated by a single bed. Emily lay there, her once vibrant face pale and drawn. Her green eyes, so much like Mrs. Thompson's, looked up at me with a mix of curiosity and pain. "Emily," I said softly, stepping closer. "I'm Leonard, a friend of your grandmother's. I'm here to help." She tried to sit up, but winced, the pain evident in her expression. "You don't have to." "Sheh," I interrupted gently, pulling a chair next to her bed. "You've been through enough. Just let me take care of this." As we talked, I could see the spark of hope reigniting in Emily's eyes, a spark that had been all but extinguished by years of suffering and despair. I explained that Dr. Patel would be coming to see her soon, that we would get her the surgery she needed, and that her life was about to change for the better. It wasn't just about the physical recovery. It was about giving her back the future that had been stolen from her. But as I looked at Emily and Mrs. Thompson, I knew that this battle would be fought on more than one front. It wasn't just about medical care. It was about justice. And justice, as Thomas had warned, would be a fight. Leaving the cottage, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I had made a promise to Mrs. Thompson, to Emily, and to myself. This was more than just a mission. It was a crusade, and I wouldn't stop until those responsible for their suffering were held accountable. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Thomas and his team worked tirelessly, uncovering a web of corruption that went far deeper than I had imagined. Alex wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of a network that protected its own, no matter the cost. But for every obstacle they threw in our path, we found a way around it. We gathered evidence, prepared our case, and waited for the right moment to strike. At the same time, Dr. Patel took charge of Emily's treatment. The surgery was scheduled, and I made sure that she had everything she needed: private nurses, the best equipment, and a comfortable place to recover. It was a far cry from the conditions she had endured, and seeing the gratitude in her eyes made every effort worthwhile. But even as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, I knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Justice wasn't just about winning a case in court. It was about exposing the truth, about making sure that the people responsible for this nightmare could never do it again. The morning of Emily's surgery dawned with a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. The tension was palpable as I made my way to the hospital, my thoughts a whirlwind of worry, hope, and determination. I had faced many challenges in my life, but this, seeing Emily through her surgery and fighting for justice, felt like the most important battle yet. I knew that everything hinged on what would happen today, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on my shoulders. As I pulled into the hospital parking lot, the sky was a bright cloudless blue, mocking the turmoil inside me. I had arranged for the best medical team in the country to perform the surgery, and Dr. Patel had assured me that Emily was in the most capable hands. But the risks were still there, lurking in the corners of my mind, gnawing at my confidence. What if something went wrong? What if, despite all our efforts, Emily didn't make it through? I pushed those thoughts aside as I entered the hospital, the sterile scent of disinfectant filling my nostrils. The staff greeted me with nods and murmured words of encouragement, but their reassurances did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I took the elevator to the surgical wing, my heart pounding with every floor it ascended. When the door slid open, I was met by Mrs. Thompson, who looked up at me with a mixture of fear and hope. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. She had aged even more in the past few weeks, the strain of Emily's condition and the impending surgery taking its toll. But there was also a quiet strength in her, a resolve that mirrored my own. "Leonard," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for being here. I don't know how we would have managed without you." I reached out and took her hands in mine, offering what comfort I could. "We're in this together, Mrs. Thompson. And Emily's going to come through this, I promise." She nodded, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. We both knew that promises were fragile things in the face of the unknown. We sat together in the waiting room, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The silence was broken only by the occasional murmur of nurses and the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. I tried to focus on the present, on the fact that we had done everything possible to give Emily the best chance, but my mind kept wandering back to the events that had led us here. It had taken weeks of planning, of maneuvering through a web of corruption and deceit to get to this point. Thomas had been relentless in his pursuit of justice, uncovering layers of rot within the police department that went far beyond Alex's crimes. The more we dug, the more we realized how deeply the corruption ran, infecting every level of the system. But we had also made progress. Thomas's team had gathered enough evidence to build a solid case, and with the help of a few brave insiders, we were close to bringing the whole thing crashing down. The legal wheels were turning, slowly but surely, and soon the time would come to expose the truth and hold those responsible accountable. I knew that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I was ready for whatever came next. The door to the waiting room swung open, and Dr. Patel stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Thompson and I stood up simultaneously, our hearts in our throats. Dr. Patel. Mrs. Thompson's voice was barely audible, her hands trembling as she gripped my arm for support. He walked over to us, his face a mask of professionalism, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that made my heart skip a beat. The surgery was a success, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Emily is in recovery now. She's stable, and with time and rehabilitation, we're hopeful that she'll regain much of her mobility. The wave of relief that washed over me was overwhelming, almost paralyzing in its intensity. Mrs. Thompson let out a soft sob, covering her face with her hands as the weight of the news sank in. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away, focusing instead on the sense of triumph that filled the room. We had done it. Emily had a real chance at a future now, a future that had been cruelly stolen from her. Thank you, Dr. Patel, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You have no idea what this means to us. He nodded, his smile widening. She's a strong young woman, Leonard, and she's lucky to have people like you fighting for her. The road to recovery will be long, but she's got a fighting spirit. I'll check in on her later, but for now, she needs to rest. As Dr. Patel left the room, Mrs. Thompson and I sat back down, the tension between us melting away. There was still so much to do, so many battles left to fight, but in that moment, we allowed ourselves a moment of peace, a moment to savor the victory. Hours later, after Emily had been moved to a private room, I finally got to see her. She was pale and groggy from the anesthesia, but when she opened her eyes and saw me, a weak smile spread across her face. Leonard, she murmured, her voice hoarse. You kept your promise. I nodded, my heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. Of course I did. And now we're going to get you back on your feet, one step at a time. She reached out, and I took her hand, holding it gently as she drifted back to sleep. Watching her, I couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something new, not just for Emily, but for all of us. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Emily's recovery began in earnest, with physical therapy sessions, checkups, and constant monitoring. Dr. Patel was optimistic, but he warned us that it would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. Emily, to her credit, faced each challenge with a determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She was ready to fight for her future, and I was determined to do everything in my power to help her. But there was another battle looming on the horizon, one that I knew I couldn't ignore. Thomas had been busy, and the evidence we had gathered was damning. Alex and his network of corrupt officers were about to face the full force of the law, and we were prepared to bring the entire system down with them if necessary. The case was set to go public, and once it did, there would be no turning back. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of therapy, I found myself alone with Emily in her hospital room. She was exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was a look of hope, of determination, of someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side ready to fight. Leonard, she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between us. I don't know how to thank you. You've done so much for me, for my grandmother. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you." I shook my head, reaching out to brush a strand of hair away from her face. "You don't have to repay me, Emily. I did this because it was the right thing to do. You deserve a future, and I'm just glad I could help give it back to you." She looked up at me, her green eyes searching mine. "But it's more than that, isn't it? Everything you've done, it's changed my life. I feel like I'm finally starting to live again, and I have you to thank for that." There was a vulnerability in her voice that tugged at something deep inside me. Over the weeks, I had watched her transform from a broken, defeated young woman into someone who was ready to reclaim her life. And in doing so, she had also changed me. She had reminded me of what really mattered, of the power of compassion and justice. She had given me a sense of purpose that went beyond business deals and wealth. "Emily," I began, my voice low and steady, "you don't owe me anything. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something more than just a sense of duty." Her eyes widened slightly, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "These past few weeks, they've been about more than just helping you. I've come to care about you, Emily, more than I ever expected. And I think there's something between us, something worth exploring if you're open to it." For a moment, she was silent, processing my words. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, one that made my heart skip a beat. "I feel the same way, Leonard. I felt it for a while now, but I was too afraid to say anything. I didn't want to complicate things." I chuckled softly, leaning closer. "Life's already complicated, Emily, but sometimes that's what makes it interesting." She laughed, a soft musical sound that filled the room with warmth. "I guess you're right." We sat there, hand in hand, the connection between us undeniable. The future was still uncertain, and there were challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. With Emily by my side, I knew we could face whatever came next. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across the hospital room, I realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. It was a chapter filled with challenges, but also with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly content, knowing that we had the strength to face whatever came next. The road ahead would still be challenging, but we faced it together, with hope and love guiding our way. The case against Alex and his corrupt network was about to unfold, and while it promised to be a brutal fight, I was ready. Justice would be served, and with Emily by my side, I felt that anything was possible. Together, we would forge a new path, one where hope and determination would light the way.